where we say we live in this giant cosmos, this universe, and it's this eternal flux of energy. And it's just swirling around in samsara. And this energy is always in conflict. This is another Heraclitus idea. It's like war is the father of all things. So the conflict between these forces is good. And the logos is the interaction and the movement of that energy and the evolution of that energy. And I guess the thesis that Nietzsche would present is that interpretation of the world, and therefore the logos, is the correct one. And if you build your worldview on this and you try to cultivate more energy and more of that, will to power, I guess you could say, in yourself, it leads to strength and health, which actually leads to the good life and success and the Platonic ideals, I guess, in a way. And it's saying that the Christian moralism is it castrates that, that the Christian even view of logos is incorrect entirely, and it moves it in the wrong direction. So this is sort of what I'm trying to figure out at the moment, and that's my best attempt to present it in down-to-earth language.
Classical theist.
Yeah, I mean, I actually really quite enjoyed that presentation of it. It's good that I think we're going down to the level of the very root of where these ideas, I think, originate from. The way I kind of approach this from the very beginning doesn't have really so much to do with what sets of ideas or what framework within which to see the world leads to, say, civilizational achievement. That is much more of a secondary byproduct of what I would consider are much more fundamental and important principles that have to be worked out before we can even discuss what leads to the good life, what leads to civilizational achievement. I mean, to even measure what is a civilizational achievement versus what isn't a civilizational achievement, it does require us to do metaphysics. It does require us to go back to first principles and sort of establish, okay, well, what is the ontological basis for the possibility of civilizational achievement or civilizational good or societal good or what have you. Your presentation of what logos means is pretty good. I would say, however, that there's a bit more to it than that. I don't think it should be read primarily through the lens of morality. I think morality is something that is more of the human participation order of being that is much broader than human morality. It's much broader than even humanity itself. We would say, for example, that the human moral order is sort of our rational participation in the eternal law of God, which moves in and through everything that exists. So, for example, the teleological impulse that leads to a tree achieving its full health, achieving its well-being as a tree. The teleological dynamics that are in play there are really the same thing that are in play for human beings, just at a higher order, because we are also endowed with reason and will. So we sort of have the ability to cooperate with the divine order of the cosmos to keep human nature itself in alignment with the same pattern of divine wisdom that's imbued in everything else. So I don't think morality, human morality, is so much the impetus behind the Christian doctrine of the Logos. Human morality is more of a byproduct of metaphysical considerations that are, in a certain sense, independent of anthropocentric consideration. We have this conception in the Thomistic tradition that the world is related to God, but God is not really related to the world. God has no real relationship to the world because he's undetermined by anything other than himself. He's undetermined by anything that's finite. When we get into these questions of what is the Logos, we're really asking questions that are thoroughly unrelated to human morality in itself, but nevertheless do as a byproduct have very strong and grave implications for human morality. Whether the Christian conception of the Logos vis-a-vis human morality leads to a sort of, shall we say, retreat from the kind of crucible that leads to greatness, perhaps we could say. I would sort of leave that to an extent as an open question. I mean, I think in certain cases in history, sure. I mean, the restraints that are put upon human beings by Christian morality does prevent you from engaging in certain activities that might end up leading to various heights of human achievement. I can concede that. On the other hand, Christian morality and Christian virtue can also serve as a catalyst for human achievement. I mean, if we have a vision of the world that views something like aesthetic accomplishment, human achievement, doing well for your own body, doing well for your family. These various human achievements that I think are, someone like Nietzsche would hold up as laudable. If the impetus behind seeking out these things is contextualized within a broader eschatological vision of the world, that has tremendous influence to inspire those great works and to bring about the kind of restraint of the passions that are necessary to cultivate the focus necessary to bring about those human achievements. I think without this moderating influence of a Christian perspective of what is virtuous and what is vicious, how one exercises the will to power, there's really no common consensus of what direction that should even lead one to. I mean, without this metaphysical conception of the logos that can undergird our understanding of vice and virtue, sure, the will to power in humanity could lead to great civilizational heights like we see in ancient Greece and Rome. It could equally lead to, I would say, human activities that I think you and I would agree are quite morally degenerate. I mean, what's to say that what we see in, say, transgenderism, how can we absolutely rule that out as an expression of the will to power if the will to power is not ultimately rooted in rational or spiritual or intellectual grasp of the real and true order of things that are imbued in the cosmos from a transcendent source? So, I mean, I guess I'm rambling a little bit, but I think that's sort of how I would at least begin to frame my disagreement.
If I can add to the logos just real quick, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Because you made a good point with Heraclitus and his definition. And this word sort of becomes this like center of philosophy, center of debate for even up until right now. Like here we are discussing what even logos is. And by the time it gets to Plato seems to apply the logos to the world in a sense where you start getting people say that the mind of Zeus is the logos and that the demiurgic power of creation is the logos. Like that is it. So Mercury or Hermes gets called the logos because he's the messenger. He's the word of Zeus in a way. And by the time we get to Philo of Alexandria, well, he likes this concept, this new Plato's idea of what the logos is. And he even writes about Mercury being the logos in his works, actually. But he takes that and applies it to Judaism and says that the logos is the Son of God who will inherit the kingdom of heaven, judge and bring the kingdom. And Philo is the one who gives us the Christian logos, basically. Christians are looking back to Philo. And when John's writing John 1, he's taking Philo's definition of this logos character who is the embodiment of truth and wisdom and life. And so by the time we get to Nietzsche, I think Nietzsche doesn't like this idea, and because the idea that we can apply logos to the world, we could debate this a little bit, but I think Nietzsche would say we can't just reduce man to logical abstraction because we have a will, and that will sometimes conflicts with rationality itself. And so Nietzsche, like myself, actually was going back to the world of the ancient Greeks and looking back before Christianity and trying to look for certain things in which he puts together this concept of the Ubermensch. The people on top are going to drive the force of society. They're the ones that are going to make all the changes. With that being said, I think his opposition to Christianity in that sense was that it is sort of a preacher of equality mentality. And he even writes about, I forgot which book it is, but I could find it if you guys really want me to. He even says when he's talking about the Soviet, he's talking about communism somewhere, and he's saying that this is not new at all. He said this is coming from the monasteries, the church communities across the Roman Empire lived like this. This is nothing new. This is from the Christians. Communism is a Christian thing. And so if you want to, you guys can challenge me on that. I could demonstrate it. He said that. I could find it somewhere, but
it was anarchism. He talks about it in Twilight of the Eyes.
I'm talking about,
yeah, because the communists weren't really around, but it was like he was talking about essentially who would become the communists. Like he was talking about those people. There's a lot you said there, so I want to try grab all of this stuff and keep it as focused as possible because we'll be going in all sorts of different directions. So loads of things I'd actually love to hear more about what you mean by these, Mr. Theist. The teleological impulse inside of a tree. When you're describing that, are you saying that the tree has a will and it's trying to form into the apex, the uber tree, I guess, in some sense? And are you saying that the will that drives that tree into its form is the will of God? Or are you suggesting that there's we'll say, a plastic force living inside this universe, which is energy, as we've described, which is in the universe, and God is outside the universe, and he actually takes that plastic force and he gives it order. And so if we took God out of the universe, we just get this like absolutely schizophrenic big blob of energy flying around like a baby playing with Play-Doh, and all the trees would turn out like spaghetti. It'd just be the stupidest place to ever live, because without God coming in with the logos in order to shape the energy into its form, it actually is it's mindless, it's soulless, it has no order of some sort. And so we have you have like
infinite Lizzos bouncing off each other and turning into silly putty and stretching out.
Yeah, 100%. So this is what we need God to put some discipline on this show. And so is the crafting force of God, that is the most important active force in the world that we need to focus on. And Nietzsche then, or we could say even the pagan perspective, is deifying energy and saying that there's an inherent intelligence immanent within energy that leads to the tree turning into the fucking tree. And that's in energy. That's an immanent force inside of this world. And then the Christian thesis is that that force is in the world, but the actual ordering force is outside of the world. And we need to align our minds with that, or we'll turn into, I don't know, the members of the cast of the Joker or something like this.
Yeah, I would mediate between everything of what you said. What I'm kind of getting at is this teleological impulse that I'm referring to, we would say comes from the act of existence. The act of existence, which would be the mode of participation in the divine existence, who is nothing but existence itself. God is the pure act of existence itself, in and through whom everything else exists by way of participation. So the tree, for example, that teleological impulse to be what it is stems from the act of existence that it receives from God, who is able to, by way of subtraction, so to speak, limit it down to a specific mode of participation in him, which is what we would call the form of the thing. The form of the thing is that limited mode participation in the divine existence that the tree in its actual existence can thereby participate in through its activity in the world. And its activity in the world is more or less perfect to the degree that it conforms to that formal imprint that is given to it by God. And it's that general pattern of being, it's that general pattern of existence that permeates all things. And human being and human nature is sort of just one participation in that grand, divinely ordained cosmic pattern that I'm kind of referring to. If I could say something about that as it relates to Christianity, I would argue that in reality, the Christian vision of the cosmos is, one could almost say, the most Ubermenschen, because its central claim is that God, who already exists from all eternity as a trinity of divine persons, and he, purely out of the will to manifest and share his own inner divine glory, creates the cosmos, which is meant to be a participation in his own life, again, for the purpose of manifesting and sharing the divine glory for its own sake. The cosmos ends up, because God creates the cosmos and imbues in the cosmos its own proper and authentic mode of being, the cosmos is sort of created with this dynamic capacity to act in accordance with this logos, we could say, through whom all things are made, or to act in ways that are counter to what we would say would be the true order of perfection that is imbued within creation. Creation itself has the capacity to stand athwart that. And we would say this began with the fall of the angels. The angels are sort of the first fruits of this divine impulse to manifest and share his glory outside of himself. But the angels aren't the be-all and end-all. God also wills for the entire created order, the entire cosmos, to also share in his inner divine perfection and his inner divine glory. And this is achieved principally through the creation of man. Man is, we would call, the minor mundi, the microcosm of all creation. He contains within himself every element of the great chain of being. He shares with all of the non-inanimate matter, basic chemical compounds, basic chemical compositions that are shared with inanimate matter. He also shares with vegetative life and animal life those elements that are proper to those grades of the hierarchy of being, and he also shares with the angel the direct participation in the life of the spirit, of intellect and will. And so man sums up the entire cosmos.
I just want to add quite literally, too, if we're talking about the shape of the human body, where you would start out with like the reproductive organs being all the way in the bottom, and then going to the heart that balances everything out, and then the head, kind of like the antenna, like the bulb of the antenna that's in connection with the cosmos. So even in the way that the human body is made, you could see examples of various esoteric designs, like the Kabbalah, for instance, or the seven chakras and so forth. Yeah, there is a connection there. But anyway, go on.
The human being, in his own essential constitution, is sort of that way in which the lowest grades, the dirtiest grades of creation are able to be overcome, so to speak, and brought into alignment with glory. And that's the initial vision for the human being. Of course, but the human being has that, likewise, that inner impulse, the inner capacity to stand athwart that divine plan, and he did, we would say. That's obviously the story of Adam and Eve. What Christ does, by becoming man himself, by achieving this absolute total union between divinity and the rest of the cosmos summed up in humanity, what he does is he dives right into this chaos that emerges from disobeying the Logos. And in diving into it, he overcomes it. He conquers the enemies of humanity, which is summed up in the world, the flesh, and the devil. And the world, the flesh, and the devil, this is actually the true source that brings humanity down to slavery, I would argue. It's the world, the flesh, and the devil that captivate our true and proper will to power, which should be sourced in the divine pattern, because it's only in aligning our will to power, the divine order that he put in creation, that we can actually tap into infinite glory. Because if the will to power is turned inwardly on oneself, then that has nowhere really to go ultimately. It's going to end in death, because it likewise is finite. It might lead to some temporal achievement, civilizational achievement, to be sure, but if it's not linked to an infinite wellspring of glory, then I don't really see a point to it. So to that extent, I would argue that Christianity, in the Christ figure, in this incarnational metaphysics, and in Christ's descent into chaos and conquering our true enemies, which culminates in his resurrection and glorified status sitting at the right hand of the Father, this enables us to transcend, I would argue, the forces that really keep us down, the forces that truly enslave us. And I understand that Nietzsche, one of his critiques of Christian morality that he calls slave morality is that it's teaching on, say, universal charity or something. It plays into the lower rungs of society, and therefore it's going to take the Ubermensch down a level and force him to play by the rules of the inferiors, right? By that reason, it kind of has this slave morality stigma to it. What I would say, though, is in obeying virtue and in avoiding vice, what we really do is we keep the lowest of the low within man himself at bay. And a non-Christian ethic, or an ethic that springs out of sort of a nihilistic approach to the objectivity of ethics, like that's sort of what the lowest of the low within man, quote unquote, wants to hear, I would say. Because the lowest of the low within man would be our ignoble passions, our tendency to just engorge ourselves with pleasure, which leads to self-destruction. These forces within us, they kind of bring down, I would say, like the Ubermenschen dynamic of the soul's triumph over the body. It brings that down to the level of the ignoble passions from, I could say, like the bottom of the barrel of humanity. And that's the real slave morality. That's fine.
You actually get power and energy from following God's structure logos, and I'm trying to describe this idea that this is actually really well presented in biological systems. For example, the thyroid structures your body to make you look beautiful. You get more energetic in life and full of life and healthy and more sexy. You become platonic by having a structured body. Whereas if you move away from God and eat the burgers, you become formless. You turn into, if you turn into a tub. And that's like a biological example of this metaphorical description, which should always pull your brakes. Another example is in music. When you take two harmonic sequences, so when you take an interval of a major fifth, for example, the mathematical perfection of these two wavelengths forming together creates a harmonic sound. Now, what's crazy is that these sounds are more energetic, hence they sound more beautiful. They align mathematically, so they generate more energy, hence they sound nice to us. When you take, for example, a seventh note, or a note that's very dissonant, which has a really bad mathematical fraction, it dissipates the energy. It's like washing in a lake or something like this and ruining the flow of energy. It just kind of chucks up the energy, and it sounds distorted as a consequence, and it sounds ugly. Again, another example of this precise principle manifesting here. And so I think what Mr. Theist is basically saying is that if you want greatness, if you want energy in this world, you have to understand that inside this world, is some sort of logical, principled force. Force is not the right word. Set of ideas. It's actually a very scientific way of thinking. This is why I think Christianity led to science, as Nietzsche said, that if you actually get close to this, or you obey this, it will give for you energy, which will also give for you beauty, which will also give for you, I guess you could say, good. All of these things are related together. And out of the world comes success. Out of the world comes greatness. Out of the world comes all of these things. And I think that's a very important frame, the best frame Christianity can present.
I love what you said, and I'd like to talk very briefly about two things related to what was said: the otherworldliness of Christianity and the relationship between transcendence and immanence in Christianity. With respect to focusing purely on the otherworldly, and therefore we neglect the world as it is now. First thing I just want to kind of preface is to say, just look at what are the Christian virtues. Let's talk about that for a second. We have, of course, in the Catholic system, we have the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. And those have to do with how we receive the life of grace, the life of sanctifying grace, which pertain directly, primarily, and principally to our relationship with God, our quest for union with God himself. But that doesn't exhaust the Christian virtues. It's not just faith, hope, and charity. It's also the cardinal virtues, which are what? They're fortitude, temperance, prudence, etc. You can kind of go on and on. Talk about the fruits of the Holy Spirit, the gifts of the Holy Spirit. But focus on fortitude and temperance and prudence for a second. These, and of course there's justice as well. These pertain directly and specifically to our life on earth. And the more we cultivate the virtues of prudence, of temperance, and fortitude, the more we bring ourselves in alignment with God. The more we bring ourselves in alignment with the life of sanctifying grace in the soul.
Do you think that Christianity is the only, worldview or religion that brings those spiritual principles into the fold?
No, I would not say that.
Okay, because we're talking back in the ancient world. Empedocles said that justice should be deified and worshipped. And
these are by no means unique to Christian revelation, but they're contextualized within a system that is unique. So it's in the practicing of these virtues, which stem from faith, hope, and charity in the soul, which enable us to contextualize all these virtues to be elevated to a state of existence that goes beyond our nature, which doesn't just enable us to live in alignment with God, but enables us to participate in the very inner life of the Trinity itself. To the extent that we not only follow these virtues, but also live the life of grace itself, that is how we attain union with God. And the thing about Christianity is that, yes, it does place of primary importance the eschaton, the end of all things, eschatological truths about the world to come. That is true. But ironically, I would argue that in placing our ultimate summum bonum in an eschatological turn of events that we don't really have any direct control over, it kind of forces us not to bring the, shall we say, egalitarian vision for humanity. It forces us not to bring that down to the level of life on earth. And so it's actually the supernatural dimension of Christianity that sort of forces us to focus not so much on ensuring absolute total equality on earth, but in ordering and structuring society in such a way that the inequalities that Christianity acknowledges exist within society, but ordering them in such a way that can maximize virtue and diminish vice according to the proper ordering of each member of society. So it embraces the inequality of humanity, actually, because it's able to contextualize inequality within a principle of equality that is supernaturally grounded. So, for example, a Christian view of things wouldn't necessitate that service to the poor come at the expense of great societal achievements of the aristocracy. Pope Leo XIII, in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, talks about how when this notion of the universal logos is properly applied to human society, it will bring out the best in each class, and it will not lead to class warfare because, for one, Christianity would say that while it is true that like the highest members of society and the aristocracy are supposed to, they're supposed to be generous with what they have and with what they've achieved, because that leads to their own self-fulfillment and their own perfection. Nevertheless, the poor are also admonished likewise not to resent the rich, not to resent the aristocracy, because they can suffer from the very same vice that the avaricious man suffers from. The poor can be more avaricious than the richest man in the world. And this is what Christ talks about being poor in spirit. Being poor in spirit means that we have a healthy detachment from material things. But the poor and the lowest rungs of society, they can be just as guilty of avarice as the very poor and the very rich. And so the vision of Christianity is to contextualize these inequalities that exist, to respect them, to actually embrace them, but to contextualize them within this broader vision of the common good, so that each member of society fully participating in society to the extent that he can, or to the extent that he's properly fulfilling his sort of given role, and that role is given either by nature or given by society itself, that in itself brings about this greater transcendent spiritual principle of equality. So this spiritual notion of equality can be accomplished in and through the inequalities of human society. So I would say that Christianity has actually a built-in mechanism to resist these negative externalities of say, mass democracy or socialism or communism, while I do recognize that what those do is I think they take that spiritual equality that we can kind of strive for, which is really just universal charity, universal love of all, willing to all what is their true good. It takes that, but it secularizes it. And in secularizing it, it leads to those systems. But it need not be secularized, and that's the point. And when it's not secularized, I would say it's actually its biggest Christianity is the biggest enemy to those systems of thought.
Well, I think so. This is good because we've been digging this down, and I don't want to go into this and straw man and talk silly, Christianity's slave and all this type of stuff, and Nietzsche's an incel and all this. What I actually see now is a very firm challenge from what I understand is the Nietzschean perspective. Now, this might be best framed as Nietzsche's idea that because Nietzsche does not want resentment. He does not want you to sit down and be bitter and stomp your feet all the time and blame Christianity for tying your shoelaces together or whatever it is. He wants you to embrace, affirm, and then move forward. Like, he's very, I guess you could say, progressive in his attitude. And what you're describing with the Christian perspective, which is very mature, it's a very, it's obviously true, it's obviously right, that there's some type of mysterious logos pregnant within the world. Knows how it got there, it looks like some form of intelligent design, and every scientist and every artist is interacting with that, and we in the West call that God, the Muslims call that Allah, and scientists and artists sometimes even come up with private relationships with it, but it doesn't matter because it's there. And Christianity claims monopoly in that, and of course they're entitled to, because every religion does, and just because every religion does is not an invalidation of Christianity at all. That's not how that works. But nonetheless, there's an interesting question implicit inside of that, where as Western man was disciplined to focus on that logos and ask that really mystical question. We all got together in our monasteries, and we stopped running around like barbarians swinging our axes, and we got together in monasteries and we sat down and we focused on the logos, and we tried to penetrate into reality. This is Nietzsche's such an astounding way that Nietzsche thought, because he saw this happening, that we began to evolve as Western people. We all sat down and we're penetrating, and we're trying to understand rocks and writing and mathematics and stones and trees. We're looking for these teleological impulses, and we're trying to understand how this Platonic order imprinted within the world produces this state of grace when you align with it? How does the musician go into that state of grace when they're playing the beautiful song? They're playing through these mathematical principles, but they're creating something that's ordered, energetic, and beautiful. This is amazing. And they do this for a long enough period of time that Nietzsche says that we ask questions about that logo so much that we begin to actually start to ask really fucking serious questions about it, such as, wait a second, is that logos actually anchored in some supernatural world? Now, why do I say this? Because I think this is where the rubber hits the road. Neil brought it up earlier. And I think what happens in the 17, 18, and 19th century is we start to realize that the logos is some type of set of principles, not rules, but set of principles that exist within the world. Just like a musician understands that there's laws of harmony. Now, the way you interact with the laws of harmony is that the laws of harmony is somewhat neutral to you. There is no morality really with the laws of harmony, but instead you as a musician have to obey them. And if you obey them correctly, you produce beauty, because this is the Christian thesis of how you produce beauty. And then if you play the piano, but you can do it with your own style, and you can bend the rules and all this, and you can actually express yourself in relationship to the rules, but you cannot violate the rules because you'll make something ugly. You have to align with the principles, but then also there's this sort of like give and take. And this evolves very quickly into the Western attitude towards science. We start to look at the world as having logical principles inside of it, a logos, and we start to wonder ourselves as these tactile master manipulators of this world. We start to play with these rules a bit. We become creators, we become manifestors, and this starts to become a very big problem, because this scientific attitude produces a very, very profound and penetrative understanding of the world that effectively starts to make us say this logos, the whole idea that this logos is anchored, the way I relate to this logos is through some type of other vessel, which we would call Christ, which we would call some supernatural force, is not the direct way that I go to it. Maybe I'm not articulating myself properly, but if I'm a scientist, my understanding is it's me going out directly to the logos of the world and communicating with it. And I don't need God. I don't need prayers. I don't need a fucking priest. I don't need a church. I don't need any of that stuff. I can go out and I can penetrate into the Platonic logos and find it and create something amazing as a consequence. And me having to go through this whole loop of conceptual thought to a supernatural world, because Christ brought it down and he's the only way towards this truth, seems like an incorrect deviation, a creation of another world that doesn't make sense at all. It seems like it's just wholly unnecessary in order to achieve the state of grace with which what science can do directly. And so I basically guess the thesis is that you can reach the divine in a sort of secular way. No, and you don't need the supernatural deviant point through Christianity and all these things as a consequence. And we were sort of educated by Christianity to think that way, and weirdly then we subverted it in and of itself. Now, I've said a hell of a lot of stuff there. I'm not sure if you're even following, but please, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I actually... So what I would argue, though, is that seems to maybe, to an extent, oversimplify the progression of Western thought vis-a-vis the role of empirical science as sort of an outgrowth of that impulse to deepen our engagement with the logos as imprinted in created things. But I would argue is actually that, in a certain way, turning away from the more, I guess we could say, philosophical or metaphysical dimensions of intellectual inquiry to the purely physical laws of nature and our ability to manipulate those for some technological achievement or whatever, that is in itself not so much a progression but a degradation. The vestiges of the logos that are imprinted in created things, it exists through a hierarchy of order. You know, there's the metaphysical principles that underlie or that undergird created things, such as act and potency and form and matter, and the role of the act of existence. Even goodness itself, goodness and perfection. These, I would say, they are still today rationally accessible truths about the metaphysical constitution of reality. Those principles, though, I would say, are at a higher level than the circumstantial ways in which natural things, physical substances tend to behave, or how they tend to be physically constituted, either chemically or subatomically or biologically, what have you. These are, I would argue, are the lower rungs of the ladder of human intellectual inquiry. Now, they do, of course, they show results in ways that are, I guess you could say, more unquestionable than, say, the debates having to do with, I don't know, like hylomorphic dualism or Cartesian dualism, these more metaphysical debates. Clearly, we can see that the stove works. We can see that the rocket actually can reach the moon, etc. But I mean, part of that is because as embodied beings, we have a greater proximity to these lower rungs of intellectual inquiry. We can have a more direct engagement with physical substances as they act towards us. You have to enter through stages of negation and removal in order to reach these higher levels of more metaphysical and philosophical inquiry. I don't think that this progression from like metaphysics to science constitutes some kind of proof that we've shaved off the need for locating the logos in a transcendent source of all things. It's more having to do with just the historical progression of our shift of focus in our intellectual inquiry. The more we focus on physical substances and how they react and what they're made out of course, we're going to lead to all kinds of technological advancements that come from that field of inquiry. But just because we've shifted our focus to that field of inquiry doesn't mean that we have thereby refuted or undermined the necessity to ultimately root those vestiges of the logos in the transcendent source of all things. That's a question that is adjudicated through metaphysics. That's a question that's adjudicated through, the classical arguments for God's existence, like St. Thomas's argument for God's existence, from the distinction between essence and existence. Those are questions that aren't going to be adjudicated by a shift of focus to these more empirical questions. We can shift our focus to that, sure, and we can produce wonderful technological advancements. That will still leave those other questions unanswered unless they're adjudicated within that realm of intellectual inquiry, which is something I don't think Nietzsche really does. I don't think he really, because Nietzsche doesn't really give a philosophical refutation of St. Thomas's argument from contingency. Maybe he does. I've not read it, but you kind of see what I'm saying.
Yeah, 100%. So I actually really like what you're saying. I think it's really well put together, and I think you're very heavily leaning on the concept of grace, which I don't think is a bad thing at all. So I'm going to try to explain it in my own words. It's like a metaphysical principle tends to be an awful lot more abstract, I guess you could say, and then a mechanical principle is Newtonian's law of thermodynamics, and you're accusing and saying, here, don't worship fucking Newton's law of gravity and think that you've found God, when God's principles might be far more profound than that. So for example, Newton will tell you that an apple falls off a tree, but maybe a higher metaphysical principle is the principle of symmetry or something like this, and these are much more sophisticated principles. And the way
to just modify that a little bit, Newton will tell you how the apple falls off the tree. Metaphysics will tell you what is motion, what is change.
So then another analogy I use in my head is with going back to that music analogy. There's a logos imprinted in music. Now, what's interesting is that at different stages of your musical career, you actually relate to the musical experience in different ways. You begin by trying to follow the patterns in the numbers, and it's very mechanical. Your interaction with the law, and you could even look at music and look at it in this very autistic, spurgy, I've got to get all the harmonics together. But that actually doesn't produce good music. It can produce sort of nice music that's technically clean, but it doesn't produce actual, you could call it graceful music. Whereas if you listen to a true talented composer, they're hitting all of the mechanical laws of harmony, but they're also doing it with abstract, you could call them metaphysical things, feel, emotion, passion, some other intangibles that are really
mystical intuition.
They're following some type of symmetrical feel to it as well. They've got rhythm. They've got all these other things that
the the Orphics were big into this kind of thing.
100%. And so this allows them to get a more sophisticated interaction. So I guess your accusation is that if the Nietzscheans, like we're going to sit around and we're going to start smashing our hammer off the table and being like, we found the scientific principles, get the fucking rid of the churches, we're done, burn the monasteries, it's over, we figured out we don't need them anymore. You're sort of like, listen, dudes, you're literally actually have started to just focus at the start once again. And
from what I understand, Nietzsche is also an anti-realist when it comes to science. I mean, like from what I understand, he doesn't even see scientific paradigms as really getting to the root of reality in the first place. So I mean, there's that disjointed element to his thinking as well. At least it seems to me. Again, not a Nietzsche scholar, so you can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
And it's not necessarily like I'm representing him perfectly either, So this is me, in some sense, using him as a guide to try help me interpret what's going on. But that's an interesting frame. Like, it's a really powerful frame. I really, really like that. It's a strong frame. It's a strong approach and a strong. Now, I think this is where another challenge comes in that is starting to, again, go to one of his very serious accusations, where you tend to have this frame of it's a slight cynicism and pessimism towards all progressive, modernizing impulses within Western man. Now, I know that we're in a state of we're in a terrible botched situation at the moment, and we're through this, going through this artistic crisis and all this. But I don't think that that's necessarily been the entire story of modernity. I think we've achieved an awful lot of aesthetic beauty and success in many different ways. And I'd even say things like metaphysical grace have shown up in very secular ways through much of our works, like the artistic period of modernism and all this. And there's a lot of things we can get into. Like, even film could be described as an extremely high art. And a great achievement. Now, of course,
for sure.
My criteria for judging all this is sort of a civilizational achievement perspective, and I've noticed that this is something that a judgment criteria that you don't want to have. Now, this is where it gets into this. It's almost like the cart before the horse, morality before the result. And Nietzsche, I guess, is pushing us to sort of say, well, listen, the Christians are turning around and telling us, you have to go back to the metaphysical principles. You have to anchor your thinking in this. You have to start from there. And this leads to this constant shooting your own foot, it feels. It stops us being able to engage with modernity and just kind of go chase after it and embrace it and go and explore these principles and go into interact with this logos and go and build something. This is his accusation of nihilism, as we'd understand it. And I've noticed this a little bit, like you're pessimistic towards civilizational achievement, and I would see that as a pretty good judgment criteria. I don't think many people would even be asking these questions as much as they are nowadays if civilization was not achieving things right now. And so, what is the situation there? And I'd love then to go into Dionysus and all this type of stuff, because Neil has loads of stuff he'd like to share.
Christians as SJWs.
We'll maybe get into that, but I guess we're sort of going there at this point. Like, there is
unfortunately, I only have like 20 minutes left myself, but I'd like to pick this up sometime soon because I've been really thoroughly enjoying this conversation.
Definitely.
But I would like to touch on some of the things you just said. I think it's actually very important. I'll concede that what I've said does sort of manifest a certain degree of pessimism toward civilizational achievement. However, I mean, you read a text like Gaudium et Spes of the Second Vatican Council, read what the popes have taught over the past 50, 60 years, and I think what you'll see is, yes, sort of a pessimism toward how much civilizational achievement can really do for the human person. However, it's not a repudiation of it. In fact, Vatican II says, in modernity, that there are rays of light, rays of sanctification that are still present even in the most post-Christian of societies, and indeed pre-Christian societies. I mean, yes, while I believe that returning to metaphysical principles and such is important, it's what's actually the most important is the life of grace itself, living in union with God himself, cultivating the virtues and avoiding vice, living in Christ. And how we can sort of get at the intellectual foundations of why that should be our framework, that will require us to do a lot of metaphysics and thinking and philosophy. However, just look at how Christianity came to approach, because I understand there was an much stronger initial skepticism in the early church, but it gradually came to be an attitude of, okay, let's look at this sort of fallen Roman Empire and sort of see what in it can be sanctified, what in it can be baptized, what in it can be integrated within this richer, at least in my judgment, richer vision of the cosmos. And so you can see, even in our liturgies, even in the development of the Roman liturgy, what we have is what did the Roman liturgy, what most characterizes the Roman liturgy? What came to characterize the Roman liturgy? Well, the use of Latin, for one, like the integration of the Latin language, the Gregorian chant, the chants of our liturgies, a lot of architectural elements that have gone into the building of these churches, these beautiful cathedrals. That was a result of church sort of looking at what is true, what is good, what is noble, what is
I gotta step in here real quick, classical theist, because I know you don't have a lot of time left. So regarding the Latin situation, while Latin is a very beautiful language and Latin mass is incredible, when it comes to how knowledge was transmitted to people, one of the issues that I've always had with this idea of the great chain of being is that in a way you are applying a control system over the populace when they don't really know what exactly is being said. If I understand it correctly, they go to church, they hear the priest say what they say, and then they go home. After, obviously, the printing press, we've had we've had the schism within the church the second time around, and we have had people who you could say took things into their own hands for better or worse, and a lot of times it was worse when it came to things like socialism and so on and so forth. But the idea that you would have a church that would impose this order upon everybody and say, okay, this is the right way of doing things, I still can't help but think that that also resulted in a lot of abuse, that people were able to level at their underlings, at the people who were not as well connected as the people who were on top because of that control system.
I almost wonder if the hierarchical structure of the church is probably something that a true Nietzschean would probably admire to some extent, maybe.
Here, what?
Go ahead. I mean, I can address that later.
Do you mind if I take that?
Go for
a little bit as well.
Go for
it. Man, like, you're describing a flaw in human nature less so than Like, I would see this, and I'm not trying to be rude, but the church is I look at it like a body. The church is trying to create this system.
St. Paul does too.
There you go, the body politic. We're trying to create this system. We're trying to create this structure that is going to try to bring a large amount of people who are busy working on farms, like a load of drunk Irish people, and they're trying to bring them towards the fucking crazy shit that we're talking about here, the logos. They're trying to bring them towards more order in their life. Nietzsche himself even says this. The credit must be given to Christianity and for Buddhism for being able to bring a people who would have been having their nose in the floor to begin looking at something beyond themselves. And these type of structures are necessarily going to be put into place in order to help take people. Now, people are always going to have to be led in some way. Like, look now, we freed everybody from Christianity and everybody just follows the news as if it's the new church. There's no difference whatsoever. Like, it just does not work this way. I'm sure within the synagogues, there's the same groupthink as well that's annoying as fuck in many different ways. Take it outside of religion altogether, and you have secular political parties. Like, people think in groups. Like, we are group thinkers in some sense. And I think Catholicism certainly would have some type of hierarchical structure because it wants to try to establish an order over what people think, to create a sort of structured way of working and all this. And it's I don't know, I'd like the free thinking and all this type of stuff, but at the same time, you have to, there's other questions you need to ask, because your ultimate goal is to try get towards the grace thing. And do you think Michelangelo really gave a fuck that would Michelangelo have created the beautiful statues of David if he was sitting around like an autistic Nietzsche and questioning, was the church really the truth and all this type of stuff? Probably not. He would have missed out on his lifetime of interacting with God actually by creating beautiful statues, secular or not, if he did this. So I think I understand where you're coming from, but I think the Catholic Church gets an awful lot of hassle for this, where it's like it's more of it's a part of reality. Everything has this in some way.
Neil, what do you think about it?
So I wanted to pull this up, and this is I think, in my opinion, and the Antichrist by Nietzsche. This is the hardest hitting bars, if you want to call it that, for just to be funny. He says the Christian concept of a God, the God of the patron of the sick, The God as a spinner of cobwebs. The God as the spirit is the one of the most corrupt concepts that has ever been set up in the world. It probably touches lower watermark in the ebbing evolution of the God type. God degenerated into the contradiction of life, instead of being its transfiguration and eternal yeah. In him, war is declared on life, on nature, on the will to live. God becomes the formula for every slander upon the here and now, and every lie about the beyond. In him, nothingness is deified. Whoo! What do you? I mean, there's a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, I just totally.
It sums